Good afternoon, everybody. We are a small group today, so hoping that maybe when the Packer game is over, I don't know where it stands, other people may wander in. But did it go into overtime? Oh, okay. So it is what it is. It may be September. I don't know, but this will be recorded, so people who are not here will be able to take part in what I think today, for those of us who are here, is going to be a really dynamic and energizing presentation. Having just spent a few minutes with Francisco prior to this to just get some background on who he is and what he does, his energy, his dynamism, his enthusiasm is very infectious. So I think we are really, really in for something that's going to feed our souls and spirits today. Francisco is a PhD student at LSTC, and he is working. His PhD is on the history of global Christianity and world missions. And so what he is really interested in, he said he has a real passion for evangelism, which I think we're really going to hear about, and looking at what is the intersectionality between Lutheran theology and mission in the United States. What does it mean? What does it mean for us as Lutherans to be founded in grace? And that's a big word, because grace talks about everybody. And how then do we live out that evangelical mission of being truly welcoming? So I think we're in for an awesome treat today. And then I just want to remind people about kind of going forward. Our next presentation is going to be, and I wrote this down this time, October 14th with Dr. Craig Nessen from Wartburg Seminary, talking about American genocides, so native populations and slavery, as I understand. I think will be his focus, so we'll be going back to some more historical perspective about the history. And if any of you are really interested in sort of being really prepared, if there's some obsessive compulsive people who like to read ahead of time, the book, The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptist is it's thick, but Scott, and I'm currently in the midst of reading it, it's really informative and a really good read. Then on November 11th, Ceogla Williams, who is a Native American and is the niece of Donna Butler, who is on our team, is going to be presenting, and she has been very on Native American land and water rights, and she's been very active in international global consortiums, I guess, and groups of indigenous peoples who have looked at land rights and native and water rights from a native perspective. And when I don't know that that's her focus, but it reminds me of the book by Naomi Klein, This Changes Everything, that looked at capitalism and climate change. So if you want to read and prepare for that, that'd be great. And another thing is this, and many of you may know about this, the Big Read that's been sponsored by Madison Christian Community. Drew Hart, who wrote the book, The Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism. He's going to be here December 1st and 2nd. So December 1st will be a presentation at Madison Christian Community from 1 to 3 p.m. Now, all of this is going to be on What Matters, and I'll send an email, so what you don't remember today is just fine, because you will be reminded of all of that in other forms. So with that, I really am delighted to... Yes?
One quick comment.
Yes.
The half hasn't been told, I think is worth reading for us, because it talks about our life in the body.
Yes.
The body and the body of Christ in a way that we don't ordinarily get to consider civil rights and ethical behavior.
Listen to him. It's true. Okay. Okay, Francisco, thank you.
got to do some tech up here. So, how's everyone doing today? Glad to hear. They told me I was going to be dragging a wire behind me. This makes me feel like, y'all remember like the shows back in the day in the 50s and 60s when you had the Sammy Davis Jr.'s. I tell folks my three favorite people in history are all Jews. Jesus Christ, Sammy Davis Jr., and Leonard Bernstein. And I'm particularly fond of Sammy Davis Jr., and so often on his shows you'll see him walking, trailing this cord behind him. So, good afternoon. I am very, very pleased to be here and to have a chance to share with you some of the insight that my life has had to offer, specifically around the subject of race. But before we get into that, who wants to learn a new song? Ready? Yeah. All right, so everyone look up there. I had some folks help me out. If you want a copy of the tune, let me know and I'll email it to you. This is a song that I wrote that I use for Bible studies or sometimes before I teach. I just thought I would start us off with some music. So, 1, 2. Holy Spirit, rain down on us, lead us, guide us with your power. Rain down on us, flow clean through us as we walk with you this hour. As we walk with you this hour. Second time's a charm. Holy Spirit, rain down on us, lead us, guide us with your power. Rain down on us, flow clean through us as we walk with you this hour. As we walk with you this hour. Amen. May the meditation of my heart and the words of my mouth be acceptable in your sight, my God and my Redeemer. Amen. First slide, please. So the title of my talk tonight is Heritage, What to Keep and What to Leave Behind. One of the things that has been very, very important for me to understand, not only just in the process of my work with this group that I'll mention a little bit later on called Decolonized Lutheranism, but much of this began as a consequence of my work with two organizations. The first is the Para-Multicultural Center at the Lutheran School of Theology, where I was the program assistant for a couple of years, as well as my work with the Hispanic Summer Program, which is a group of, they basically have 2-week intensives in theology at different locations all throughout the country. And one of the things that's really important when you're talking about any complicated subject is you have to know where you stand. So I tend to start with this first question. How many of you, had you not known my name, would have known that I was Latino? Brothers usually know. African Americans tend to know, usually. But a lot of folks don't, can you? Well, there are reasons why. And one of the things that for me was really important, especially as I started seriously confronting the issue of racial injustice and bias and racism, is that I had to be very, very, very careful. And so one of the things that I try to do, because there are very much parts of me that could stand in front, and I have done this, I've stood in front of rooms of white pastors and white church leaders and have really dug into them for the way that they treat their brothers and sisters of color and the way they have treated me. But at the same token, I have to also be honest about the same things that they struggle with. I have had to struggle with too. Because it's important for me, if I'm going to be loving my neighbor as myself, I have to be aware of the ways that even when I think I'm loving my neighbor, I'm actually hurting them. And being aware of the way that my skin color has given me not a small amount of confusion in the society, but obviously, clearly, a great deal of advantage, has been one of the most important things of my life. So I have this presentation. The nice title is Heritage, What to Keep, What to Leave Behind, but what is the real title is, and I've been told I can be a little more direct with y'all. The real title is How La Familia Herrera Became White. I wasn't expecting that to be funny. That was kind of cool. I'm going to remember that. Because that's really what we're talking about. Es interesante porque me llamo Francisco Herrera, okay? This name, clearly, I am not from Sweden, okay? And it was funny because, however, talking about the way that I was raised, the first language that I really learned after learning English was German. And it was funny, though, because I was involved in classical music. That was what I was doing for many years before I entered seminary. I'm a classically trained violist and orchestra conductor, and I've toured and done all kinds of playing. And especially living overseas, I was in Geneva, Switzerland for many years. But traveling the country, people see my name, and it's like, Francisco Herrera. And they just start speaking Spanish to me, and I didn't speak Spanish. And so eventually I just got tired of that happening. By that point, I had learned not only German, but French, because I was living in Geneva, Switzerland, as I mentioned. And I just like, well, I should really learn this language. And that's really when a lot of pieces that had been falling in place for years really started hitting. And as I started to become more connected to the Latino community, invariably I had to go back and look at how I came from an immigrant family and how whiteness and my perceived whiteness had benefited me over the years. So I've started talking about it as a way to kind of give people some insight as how to talk about their own privilege that they have because of their skin color. I'd like to start off with, first of all, my father's, sorry, I keep forgetting these aren't connected. This is a photograph of my father. He's the one over here on the far left in the back, Ricardo. He went by Richard for much of his life. That's his brother, my brother Albert, his brother, my uncle Albert, my uncle Luis. Then right there, that's Manuel. That's my Aunt Linda. She always has that look on her face in every picture. Then here in the lower left-hand corner, this is my uncle Alfred. He was intellectually disabled. This is my Aunt Bibiana, or Bibi as we called her. This is my Aunt Olivia. She also was intellectually disabled. It was interesting. I didn't see her at all between the ages of 6 and 30. I saw her at the wedding of my brother Nick. And out of the blue, I hear this voice just going, Francisco, Francisco, Francisco. She comes running to me and she goes, I've missed you so much. Where have you been all this time? Are you okay? Oh, you're so handsome. I hadn't seen her since for literally 24 years, and she remembered me immediately. Then that is then my, next to her, that's my Aunt Rachel. And then my uncle Roberto. Now, you can already see here, and the gentleman in the corner that you really can't see too well, that's my grandfather, Ezequiel, or my abuelo, as I say. You can see already within my aunts and uncles that there are some that are significantly lighter skinned than others. My father is by far, and my uncle Albert are by far the lightest skin. Alfred is very light here, but he at times was pretty olive skinned. Later, I remember him as a child. Similarly, my uncle Roberto. My other aunts and uncles, Manuel, I mean, you can see pretty clearly, he's the one in the middle. He's the oldest in the family. Bibi, Olivia, even my uncle Luis, who's kind of stuck there in the back between Alberto and Manuel, they're all pretty dark skin. But already this created a hierarchy even within the family of my uncles and my aunts. My sister once told me that my father, who was almost perfectly in the middle in terms of birth order, was kind of my grandfather's favorite. And I would not be surprised that all of it was because, well, first of all, he was the only one of all of his brothers and sisters to actually graduate from high school, kind of a big deal back then. He, like my aunts and all of my uncles, was in the military. He was in the Air Force. My father never saw combat, whereas 2 of my uncles were in Korea and 2 of them were in World War II. But he actually, you know, in many respects went on to have a pretty decent life. And as a consequence, my grandfather tended to treat him a little bit better. This is a photograph then of my, next picture please. My bad, I keep forgetting. This is a photograph then of my mother on the left. That is, her name is Marina. Marina Franco de Lemos, so she's Portuguese. So she met my dad because he was stationed in the Air Force in an island called Herrera, which was one of 9 islands to an archipelago owned by, or as part of Portugal, called the Azores. And the most recent kind of claim to infamy Herrera has is that the day that George W. Bush announced the impending invasion of Iraq back in 2003, he did so from the military base in Herrera, because also a major NATO site. But that's where they met, and they met sometime in '59. Got married about then. My sister Rachel came along probably about, I think it was about 7-8 months after the wedding. So yeah, right, they don't like talking about that, but it's true. And so it was also kind of interesting, some class things. My father actually grew up quite poor. My grandfather was a bracero, so he came to the United States as a worker on the railroad for Union Pacific at a time when the US had cut down immigration from everywhere. And he spent 35 years of his life working either coal, so like shoveling coal, or helping to run steam engines. He eventually ended up as being an actual engineer, like a mechanic, on the coal engines, and he retired when they switched over to diesel. And my mother, on the other hand, very much aristocratic background. Her father, who's kind of my spiritual root, had a customs business in the Azores. So I talk about my abuelo and my abuela, right? That's my Mexican side. So my aveu, which is grandfather in Portuguese, as I mentioned, had this business. And my avó, my grandmother, was actually a classically trained pianist. She had to cut her career short because of, a little thing called the Blitzkrieg happened, and it's kind of hard to study piano in Belgium when the Nazis are invading. So she curbed her career, but as you can tell, my mom came from a pretty high-class background. And my father always felt really pretty fortunate because she's a very lovely woman. And, but as you can also see, she's quite light-skinned. Let's just get back to the topic at hand. Next slide, please. Now, this picture is a photograph that's happened, this is about 1967, I think, maybe even 68. And at this point, you now have all of my aunts and uncles, as well as their spouses and all of their children. My mother is over here in the lower left-hand corner. If you look straight up, the gentleman in the back, that is Alberto, my uncle. Alfred standing next to him. Down in front of him to his right is his wife, Terry, but her name is Teresa. She's actually Mexican as well, but quite light-skinned, as you can see. And then you have the whole panoply. I really wish I had a pointer. So this is my sister Rachel. Oh crap, I'm gonna die. This is my sister Rachel right here. This is my sister Patricia. My sister, that's Maria Luisa right there. Behind her, with the big smile, it's my brother Richard. And then my brother Nicholas is actually sitting here on my mother's lap. So, but you can also see that the lighter-skinned members of the family, here's my Uncle Robert right here, married women, who were lighter skinned as well. And within very short order, as you can see now, there's a very clear color difference in the members of my family. This is something that my father also encouraged, because he still had a pretty hard time being a Mexican American, working in the field that he was in, which was television. And as a consequence, he really did everything he could to keep himself lighter skinned. He tended to keep himself covered before he went outside. He encouraged my siblings to not play outside in the sun very much during sunny days, often not telling them why, but that was the reason why. And the notion of skin color and being lighter skinned was important for him, and it later showed. To make an even stronger comparison, next picture, please. This is a photograph. The woman on the left is a cousin of my father's, Catarina Rocha, Kathy, as we always knew her growing up. And that's her son Miguel, one of my cousins. And this is my dad's family. And of course, next to her is my mother, my brother Richard, who's in the middle, my sister Maria on her lap, and then one of my favorite photographs of my sister Rachel, when she's about 5 there. So you can see this is the same family. And when you look at especially a photograph like this, my sister Rachel would talk about, growing up, it was pretty much just understood we were the white family, because they were the lightest skinned. Next slide, please. Fast forward to the 70s. And here you have all of my brothers and sisters. My sister Rachel, my sister Maria Luisa. She's the only person, she mostly goes by Maria or Mary these days. There's my brother Nicholas in the middle, my mother, my sister Patricia, and then down there on the lower left, that's my brother Richard. So this is about 1971, 72. And so at this point, this is a white family. Anybody who was looking at this photograph would never ever guess that everybody's last name was Herrera. Likely wouldn't happen. And so this is really a very important step for me to talk about. The situation and the conditions that went into making the environment that I grew up in. The fact that my father, even though my mother spoke Spanish, she's Portuguese, so Spanish was an important language that she was in her environment. He deliberately insisted that only English be spoken in the house. Now, part of that was simply because it had been very hard for him as a child because the only language they spoke at home was Spanish. He didn't want his children to have that problem. But that made an extra step and a contribution towards the whitening of my family, as well as separated us from an important part of our culture and our roots. One of the other things that I also frequently will mention is, so my father was involved in television. He was a cameraman as well as a photographer for the ABC station in Kansas City, Missouri, KMBC. And he had originally gotten the idea of going into television, in part because he made small sort of instructional videos for the military, for the Air Force, little films. And apparently at some point he was on shore leave and he was somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico. And he met a guy who was born and raised in the US, but his family was from Guatemala. And told him, you know what you should try doing? He said, you know what you should try doing, Herrera? You need to think going into television. This is like the late 50s, like 59, 57. And he said, you're going to be able to, they're looking for people, you have the skill, this is something that could potentially help you. And so my dad thought, yes, why not? He said, and my dad told me the story though. He said, however, it was really interesting seeing this guy, because here we were on the Gulf of Mexico, and it was like 95 degrees outside, but he was completely covered. Long sleeve shirt, big old brim hat, turtleneck. It's 92 degrees outside on the Gulf of Mexico. But the guy was terrified of getting any darker. And so he covered himself up completely. So these are all things that went to the formation of how my father understood the country, how he understood the color of his skin, and what he had to do to make sure that he could pass for as light as possible. Next slide, please. That's not symbol. Oh, no. The slide before that, the blank slide. We're gonna get to that in a minute. That's gonna be sort of part 2. So these are all the things that went into making me white, essentially. I was originally going to go and talk a little bit about how I got my education and how I started deconstructing my whiteness. But I kind of wanted to leave a little bit more time for us to talk, so I'm going to give kind of the Reader's Digest version of what were the steps that I had to make. So I never saw myself as white growing up, never. With a name like Francisco Herrera, it was impossible. But at the same token, it was a very difficult thing to know exactly where I fit, because all the white kids that I grew up around all made fun of me for being a dumb Mexican. And all the Mexican kids that I met made fun of me because I was so white and didn't speak Spanish. It didn't particularly help that my father was terribly, terribly, terribly abusive to my family. Abuse runs in families, right? So as a consequence, at the age of about 4, he could no longer have an important and prominent place in my life because he was so abusive. It got so bad that when I was 6, he tried to kidnap me. So at that point, not only then was I already separated from the language of my culture, of the Mexican community. Never mind the fact that my father, by that point, was a pretty prominent member of the Mexican-American community, still is, in Kansas City. But I couldn't even go to anything that they did because it was essentially like playing Russian roulette. We would never know what would happen to me if my father got a hold of me again. And so all of these things coupled with that, then of course my mother gets divorced, and she moves from Kansas City, Missouri, into Kansas City, Kansas. So she takes me from one place with greater ethnic diversity to a region of the country with significantly less ethnic diversity. Enrolls me in a very excellent public school district, in which all of my years in elementary school, there was only 2 other Latino descent students, one Mexican-American like me, Didi Corona, never forget her, and another girl named Ana Maria, whose family was from Costa Rica. But Ana Maria was light-skinned like me. And we had no connection, and they liked to make fun of me because I was so white and didn't speak Spanish. So little by little, then I start going into high school, and I'm involved in things like theater. I'm involved in things like debate and forensics. I'm an Eagle Scout. That's one thing I am kind of happy and proud about. So everything that went into the making of the culture that I came from was ultimately infused by whiteness. Completely. But the thing is that there were always enough things to remind me that I wasn't white. But I could never really quite fit. This is also when a lot of the subconscious programming came in. Being told that I'm too emotional. Being told that I'm too touchy-feely, I need to learn to restrain these things. Or that I'm too effusive, I have too much energy. And Francisco, maybe you should really just try kind of mellowing out. Understand that people are different from you, right? And so these are the things that I'm taught from a very, very, very young age. These are all things that are very much tied to Midwestern white culture and not tied to the Latino culture that I came from. And I joke with people, we may have been an assimilated immigrant family, but we were still an immigrant family. For me, what's also kind of funny in the past couple of years is trying to talk about these subjects seriously with my siblings. And they see themselves, they acknowledge sort of their Mexican roots. But they don't necessarily connect themselves really to, say, for instance, the injustices going on at the border these days, or that has been going on for forever. Except my brother Richard, he's actually pretty good about that. But the disconnect is so thorough. I remember back in 2014 getting picked up by my mother and my sister, who half my family now lives in Texas. And I will never forget, I'm telling the story of a friend of mine, a white lady in Chicago. Her husband, however, is from Bolivia. And they went through this long, torturous process to help to bring his mother into the country so they could keep an eye on her. She sold her property in Bolivia. They had done all the kinds of arrangements with insurance and housing and everything to make sure that she would produce no problem or burden for the state at all. And they still denied her application, despite all of that time, all of that money, and all of that energy. And I remember talking about this with my sister and my mom, and at some point, my sister Patricia says, well, but what country was she applying for a visa for? And I said, ours. And she kind of went like this. And she goes, well, that's just the problem with all these illegals trying to get in. It just makes the process more difficult for everybody. I couldn't believe that she said that. But of course, what did we have for dinner the following night at her place that she cooked but chicken, mole, sopa, and she went and got fresh menudo and tortillas from one of the local tiendas. The disconnect is massive. And for me, what's also curious is that my brothers and sisters, they grew up with a Mexican family. I didn't. And even though in my own family, they have more directions to this kind of culture, they don't feel the same sense of connection and responsibility to the folks at the border like I do. Ultimately, what did help to make a little bit of the bridge, because clearly now I don't have any problems identifying myself as Latino, right? The thing that really helped me was an organization called the Hispanic Summer Program that I mentioned earlier. And what did it was I went out there for the first of 4 sessions that I had participated in 2010. And what was great about it is that this was the first time that I could be around a bunch of other Latinos like me. Latinos that were lighter skinned, that tended to be made fun of by their other Mexican American or Puerto Rican American or Bolivian peers that they went to school with. Because they were lighter skinned, because they didn't speak the language, because their parents had different kinds of jobs. And so it was interesting for the first time in my life to be a part, not of just a Latino community, because I've been part of Latino communities, especially when I lived in Europe, but part of a Latino community that was really discussing the issues of the Latino community. Like, what does it mean for those of us that are passing? Like, how do we work? How do we help our brothers and sisters in the church to deal with the injustices in the country? And that formation really, really made a big impact on me. Another thing which really also had a huge impact on me was my time living in Geneva, Switzerland. This happened from 1999 to 2005. There were 2 main reasons for this. The first one was that for the first time in my life, I found myself actually in a Latino community. Because at the conservatory where I was studying, there were a large number of students from Latin America. And they would make fun of me. It was like, mira el gringo, right? They would call me el gringo, el americano sometimes as well. But they still very much saw me as one of their own. And they welcomed me in. And so that was one of the first places where I got a chance to see how I fit, my understanding of passion, my understanding of boundaries. It's a really important thing. A buddy of mine just wrote a really marvelous blog post for the Seminary Diversity blog, specifically on boundaries in the Latino community and how they don't line up for Latinos in the ELC as opposed to white folks. It's a fascinating blog. But understandings of community, understanding of how you read the Bible, how you relate to church, how you pray. It was amazing because for the first time in my life, I had an entire community that I actually fit into, that I had never had before. And these things together really helped quite a bit with this little community. The other thing that really helped me a lot to kind of deconstruct my American white experience was the fact that I was when I lived in Europe, that I belonged to a really, really amazing Lutheran church called the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Geneva, where you had 47 different nationalities and 39 different languages spoken by one church. I could not ever see myself, one of the big obstacles to becoming a Christian, especially as someone who's queer and was very much part of the Pride movement in the 1990s. I couldn't see myself becoming part of a community where it seemed like it was run by a bunch of highly organized white folks that were constantly telling me and my friends we were going to hell. I very much felt the call of the Spirit. I'd been reading Scripture, but it was just very difficult for me to be involved with a religious community that was like that. Well, then I find this fantastic church in Geneva, Switzerland, where I see that actually the call of Christ and the gospel is a global thing. But one of the other things that it enforced me to do was to, as we would talk about it at the time, to analyze my Americanness, not to be so American. That's how they called it. For instance, being at a Bible study and always being so eager to share, so eager to talk, right? And, some of the members say that we're from Kenya or from Brazil or from Japan, would sit there quietly and listen until eventually all the Americans stopped talking, and then the Bible study was over. And it was one of my mentors, a wonderful man by the name of Bill Strelo. He just died a couple of years ago. One day told me, he's like, Francisco, you have a big mustache and beard. You need to stop being so American. What do you mean? He said, in our country, they just make you think that everybody has to hear what you say all the time. Why don't you just try not talking next week? So these were the kinds of people that I were working with. So a lot of this deprogramming happened gradually over the course of several years, but it was also because I wasn't living in predominantly white communities in the U.S. The last and final sort of straw that helped to make that change was my divinity studies at Chicago Theological Seminary. The Chicago Theological Seminary, or CTS as we like to call it, is a seminary in the tradition of the United Church of Christ, and it has a ridiculous amount of diversity. Half of the students are people of color, half of them are white, half of them are over 30, half of them are under 30. About a third of the faculty members are queer, half of them are people of color. And so it was just an extremely diverse environment. And so having professors talk about pastoral care and about dealing with violence, in my first pastoral care course, we talked about the talk, which, in white communities is usually, talking about the birds and the bees. But in the African American community, it's what you do to make sure you don't get shot. When you have a professor who is still a titan by the name of Lee Butler Jr., give a lecture on what it means to provide pastoral care using tools that he learned as a long practitioner and as a psychotherapist in the African American community, but showing the ways that it actually can influence the way a lot of white folks think about therapy, and then have fully a third of the white students in the class push back. Seeing those things lived out in front of me made a huge impact. And so that's not to say that I didn't make my mistakes. But ultimately, there was walking along with this process as I was understanding myself as a Latino. I also had to do an enormous amount of deprogramming of the ways that white society, and especially white Midwestern society, had taught me what was right and what was wrong. What was appropriate for a leader of the church to do, and what was inappropriate for a leader of the church to do. What were lines of thoughts and basis for theological education were appropriate for someone in the church to do, and what were not appropriate to do. And all of these things over the course, about 6 years, really helped to get me to process what it means to be a light-skinned Latino, and then to find a way where I can kind of straddle these two worlds. And this is actually one of the reasons why I'm really excited to do this talk today. Because normally when we talk about anti-racism efforts, when we talk about educating ourselves about privilege and race and power, much of the time you tend to hear one of two perspectives. You'll either hear folks from a community of color sharing their stories and the kinds of things that they have to suffer and what they have to work with, as well as calls for solidarity. You'll frequently have communities of white folks, of European Americans, that talk about how folks can analyze their privilege, how they can understand their lives and where they come from in such a way that they can not only become better advocates and accomplices for communities of color that are fighting for justice, but in terms of how to deepen their own faith, as well as just to become a better human in general. But then you got me. Because on the one level, absolutely, I have experienced racism in the course of my life. And the worst part is that everybody who treated me, and this is kind of the weird thing, the moment that I realized this, is that everybody thought that they were doing the right thing. But what they were doing was slowly killing me. Why I never made that connection, because I can't count how many African Americans or Mexican Americans I heard told me similar stories, but I never connected it to my own, until there was a moment that I did. So on the one hand, I very much know what it means to deal with racism and the pain that causes. But at the same token, I also know what it means to benefit because of the color of my skin. I know what it means to be hanging out with my buddy Pedro, and suddenly a police cruiser pulls up, and that the cop immediately goes to him and talking with me as if I'm not, as if, I'm somehow a victim. Never mind the fact that the phone call had nothing to do with the two of us. I know what it means to walk into a room with a bunch of active African-American organizers that I worked with about 5 or 6 years ago, and to visibly notice everybody tense up. Because the name they saw was Francisco Herrera. They were expecting a Latino to come in, and he did, but they weren't expecting him to look like me. And so the process of having to work with them to accept the flash judgment they had, to understand the reason why they responded to me like that, why they had the suspicion, why there was a lack of trust. All of these things have been very, very valuable insights that, when possible, I try to share with other audiences, because I have very much suffered many of the things that my African American friends have suffered. I have suffered very much the kinds of things that my immigrant kin from Latin America or from India or wherever have suffered. But I also have a lot that I haven't. And so one of the purposes of my life now in my career is to try to make a bridge, and to show, with the hope that some of the insight that I have can help a little bit. All right, so now we have officially reached the halfway point of my talk. The second part of the conversation is going to be a little bit more focused on, let me do one little thing. The second part of the conversation is going to be focusing a little bit more about how you focus on and making concrete efforts to address the issue of power and privilege in your life in relationship to marginalized communities. But before we go there, I thought I would just take about 5 minutes and just open to some questions, if anybody has them. Miss, your name? Oh yeah, we have microphones. Hold on a sec. I'm supposed to, I forgot about that. Microphone.
Solveig Carlson.
I love that name, by the way.
We spent, speaking of name, I've lived for years getting things in the mail addressed to Mr. Because nobody really knows what a Solveig is unless you're Scandinavian.
Right.
But we lived in Africa for a couple years, and I never really thought about it too much.
Where in Africa?
Yeah, what's now Zimbabwe.
Okay.
My husband was there on a seminary internship program, believe it or not.
So you lived there when it was Rhodesia?
Yes.
Oh
yes,
my goodness.
Yes. And
Whoa.
we had 3 young people that served as our servants, if you will, in helping with housework and garden work and with our children. And they, when we would go into the city of 140 miles away to get groceries and just to have a break from the mission station, they would request that we bring back to them Sunlight soap. And they thought and felt that by using that soap, it would lighten their skin.
Yeah, absolutely.
So color, the deep, dark colors of southern Africa was significant, and they saw a privilege in being lighter. So I know what you're talking about when it comes to color, and we don't often see the differences or the difference that makes until we've come face to face.
And how did you deal with that?
I
That's the
was-
question, because that's a big deal, because that's actually a very vulnerable statement that they made. And so how did you respond to that?
Well, I remember talking with Sibusiso, who was our first house girl, and I said, you don't need to be lighter. You're beautiful as you are. And I don't think I knew what I was saying, nor did she fully understand what I was saying. But now, 45 years later, I get it. And so I don't know that I necessarily faced it as I should have, could have, should have, would have, could have.
Do you have any situations where you face similar things now, where you have people not just treating you with deference because of your skin color, but that on some level talk like, oh, if my skin was lighter, I could do this. Oh, if my skin was lighter, I could do that. Have you heard anything like that with any of the communities that you've been around since you've returned here in the U.S.?
No, I don't think so, but we work a lot with refugees from Bhutan, and they, I think sometimes their connection with us, as they call us grandma and grandpa, I suspect they feel that by connecting with us white folks, that they will have privilege in assimilating, in...
And that's true.
Yeah, I think
They
so.
will have privilege. Right.
Yeah.
So I think it would be really interesting to see what are ways that you think you can work to make sure that that privilege is seen as a service on your part, as opposed to something where on some level they might be inadvertently subjecting themselves to you. That's the thing that I would, if I would give you a takeaway. That's actually what I'm talking about in the second half, a little bit about this. But thank you. Other questions? I don't mean to cut you off. No, but you bring up, I mean, I have to deal with this all the time. I mean, for me, the first skill that I can give as a consequence of not only being light-skinned, but having been in classical music, is that I am a heck of a fundraiser. Everybody needs money. So what I'll do when I go work, say, with the Casa Aztlan in Chicago, which is a sort of a Latino student group, or when I work with the Para Multicultural Center, is fundraising. Just like, great, I can bring in money. How much do you need? Boom, 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 boom. And that's a way to kind of effectively leverage the privilege that I have because of the color of my skin. But I'll talk about that a little more in the second half. Anybody else? All the way in the back. Hello, friend. How are you doing? Good to see you.
I can so relate to the color of the skin. My mother and father were boarding school victims, as their mother and father's aunts, uncles, etc.
Yeah.
So that, of course, affected us. And I remember, as a child, my mother would buy lemons and make us sit down and put the lemons, cut them in half, put them on our knees and our elbows to lighten the color of our skin.
Yep.
And I remember one painful thing, we didn't have a tub when I was a child, and we had the metal old round tubs. And she'd have to fill the water, into the tubs so we could bathe. And usually it was my sister that's very close to me, or at least she was. We're a year apart, and we'd bathe together because, of course, it was an effort to get that water into that tub, etc. My mother had a brainstorm that she would put bleach in our water.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And I remember screaming,
Yeah.
my sister too,
Yeah.
that our privates were burning.
Yeah.
And I believe it was my father, God bless him, that came from the living room and said, Vivian, her name's Vivian, what are you doing? What are you doing? Well, I put a little bleach in the water. They're crying, get them out of the tub,
Right.
which she did. I assume she never did that. I don't remember a lot of my childhood. And so my sister that we went through with that together, she was darker than me. My father, somewhere along the line in the background, was French. and he was darker. And my sister was traumatized throughout her life because she was darker than me, including the church, the Lutheran church that we were forced to attend every Sunday.
What
We
part
were
of the country were you in?
Up north in Seymour, Wisconsin, out
Okay.
of Green Bay.
Okay.
And we were the only, out of the 800-member congregation, the only 2 Native Americans. And we were the poor Native Americans. They were the better off family that was well off. And so my sister has a horrible memories of being treated differently, spoken differently, too, because she was darker than me. And so she has a very negative attitude toward the church because of that, because she was scarred. So I always felt her pain, of course, you know, she's my sister and I love her. But that's the effects of trickle down, you know what, from generations of being abused and, you know, living through that horror that the boarding schools did to my people. And of course, my folks didn't talk about it. My grandparents didn't talk about it. It was like a war, like our warriors. They don't talk about the war. But that is the trauma, and I can only imagine the stuff that other families went through that their folks, you know, didn't value. And of course, that was beaten out of my mother and father, you know, who they were, you know, and stuff like that. But I remember her always saying, be proud of who you are. Okay, well, we're proud of who, but at the same time, you know, they had their problems, and of course, it was passed down to us, but thank God, you know, I like to think you know, but like I say, I don't remember a lot of my childhood. I blocked that stuff up. Yeah, but thank you for saying that. People don't realize that. Thank you.
And the trauma never goes away. You do not heal from that kind of pain, ever. I think that's a really important thing. There's so much of the culture of the United States that really likes the idea that somehow you can completely get past pain, even though it's not true. But they certainly like reminding you of that if you're trying to remind them of the broader society as something like intergenerational trauma. One of the things that I always think about when I went to Israel the first time, there was our tour guide was this guy named Jared, and he told a story of a friend of his named Ilat. And Ilat had grown up in a perfectly secular Jewish household. They didn't have anybody who had died in the Holocaust because they'd all had immigrated to the United States in the early 19th century. And so she wasn't raised with this at all, with the stories of the Holocaust or anything. I mean, of course, she read about it as everybody does in the United States, but it wasn't a major thing. And then one day, she was in New York, being shown an apartment, and the agent went and took them into this room, kind of a pantry, and there were a couple of small doors where you could store like grain and things like that. And she looks at this small little cupboard, and the first thought that crosses her mind was, oh, you could hide a child in there. And it jolted her, because there was nothing particularly in her education that would have necessarily put that into her mind. But trauma is actually inherited. I don't know how many of you folks know about that, but there have actually been studies that have shown that trauma is passed down from generation to generation. It literally goes into our genes. And it's a survival mechanism, right? It allows us to have a certain kind of awareness and understanding that we don't necessarily have, thank you, sister, that we don't necessarily have time to learn, right? We have extra responses. But you never really heal from that kind of pain. It goes into your blood. Or like, as I like to point out from Genesis, when God is talking to Cain, and he says, oh, what have you done? Your brother's blood is crying out from the ground. That's kind of how I see that trauma. It soaks into the stones of the ground. It soaks into the very foundations of our being, in our genetics. I'll take one more little question, and we're going to take a short break. Yes. I don't have family reunions. That is, so, do you know Mike Russell by chance?
Oh, yeah.
Pastor Mike Russell? He was the first person to point this out to me. Because I told him one day, I was like, man, I am so angry. I'm angry at everybody. And we had a good long chat. And he told me, it's like, okay, so I think I got you. I think I got this. Like, tell me if this makes sense. So you're angry because despite your light skin and despite the fact you're doing X, Y, Z, the white folks have never accepted you. But you're also angry because even though you're Latino, and even though that's your blood, they've never accepted you either, and so you never know where to go. And it was like somebody literally cut me in half. Yeah, I don't. You saw up there, right? That huge family.
But was that from a family reunion that you all had? Or,
I think that was just a little get-together. That was literally mostly just my aunts and uncles and their spouses. So we're not even talking like cousins and stuff like that. It was just, my father was one of 10 children that survived to adulthood. And so that's a big deal. But no, we don't have any. The ones who are really, really most marked by that are my brothers and sisters because they grew up with that entire family, especially my sister Rachel. But after the divorce, my father did some really bad things, y'all. Half of my family completely cut contact with that side of the family. And then actually it was my brothers and one of my sisters who still more or less kept in touch. But that loss is palpable. Going to school with people that are my cousins. Actually, the children of my cousins. There's a big age gap in my family. Courtney Herrera, I'll never forget. She is the oldest daughter of my cousin Stephen. He was one of the children of Alberto and Teresa, or Albert and Terry. So that was, I think, their first or second grandchild. And she wouldn't have nothing to do with me. And, but I remember people would make fun of her for being Mexican, which was stupid. And it was all these guys that I hung out with on the bus. And I never forget, they would go, Courtney Herrera, ay, 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 ay. They would just scream like that. At one point I said, guys, would you fucking stop? Excuse me. I said, guys, would you stop? That's my cousin. You don't do that. And they never did it again. But it's there. The other thing that it just with the family reunions being really bad, so I mentioned my brothers still talk to my father and my father's family. Well, when my brother Nicholas got married in 2006, he would have family get-togethers with my cousins and aunts and uncles and stuff. And at one of these events, my sister Rachel came. My sister Rachel hadn't contacted any of them since 1979. So here we are 27 years, maybe even 28 years later. And she literally just dropped off the face of the earth. And so all of the cousins started like, oh my God, how are you? I mean, they loved her. Everybody loves my sister Rachel. She's amazing. And they say, oh, where you been? What's been going on? And what happened? Well, then she told them what my father did to her. And about the court proceedings and everything. Of course, none of my aunts, my uncles supported my family, actually. My uncles, for whatever reason, were really, really good to my mom and my brothers and sisters, not my aunts. My aunts lied about my mother in court horribly. And so all of my cousins then kind of rose up en masse to talk with and confront their parents right there. Like, why didn't you tell us about this? And they, for the first time, I think probably the first time they ever probably spoke honestly about what happened, they told my cousins, well, we didn't know what to do. It was we just were so panicked, and all we thought we could do was we have to support our brother. Never mind the fact that, 98% chance that they were abused by my grandfather. In fact, I'm very, very sure of that. Other stories that I have there from my sister. And they all, after that though, they said, Rachel, it's just so great to have you back. We'll be in touch. We got this thing coming up here. We'll give you a call there. And they never called her. That army of cousins from the 7 other people in my family, 8 other people in my, 7 other people, aunts and uncles that had all these kids. Even though they talked about how much they missed my sister, they could not confront the fact of what my father did. And but that's family too, right? And it's tricky. Most of my Mexican family in Kansas City, there are like 3 or 4 major exceptions, but for the most part, they've just all assimilated more or less seamlessly into white society. About half of so like all my aunts, of course, got married to American men, and so they all had white last names. And then a good chunk of my cousins either didn't have Latino last names. Their last names now are things like Bryant or Davidson or Ronald or whatever. And then, of course, all of the female cousins we had who had names like Palos and Herrera and whatnot, they've all married white men since then. So of my cousins, I think I have about 20-some cousins, there are really only 2 or 3 that I know that are actually really down with La Raza. And it's kind of funny because I'm a lot younger than they are. But we have been able to find a little bit of connection on that score. But yeah, it's not pretty. Yeah. Not that I know of. Well, here's the thing too. On some level, your name is really kind of a mask. One of the books that also helped me a lot when I was working out my whole Latino identity thing is a really great book called How do you get to be Mexican? Written by a guy named Kevin Johnson. Kevin Johnson. Kevin Johnson is a lawyer and a law professor at Yale. He was one of the first to get in on specifically Latino scholarships back in the early 80s. His father is a big burly white guy, had a fair amount of money. He worked for like the water department in Los Angeles. It was his mother who was Mexican. She had like undiagnosed bipolar disorder. But the mother didn't want him to be Mexican. And she would constantly insist that they were Spanish, even though very much Indio, very dark skin, very dark hair. It was the father that encouraged him to connect with his Mexican roots. And so, but one of the things that he wrestles with is, am I really Mexican or not? And so on some level, I wouldn't necessarily think that to be really all that important unless you want to make that kind of change, if you want to reclaim something. But no, I'm pretty sure all of them have kept the names that they've been born with. We're working on it? There we go. Oh, good. No, actually, yeah. Is that it? Yeah. So for the second half, I just want to sing a round of Amazing Grace. But because so much of what I'm talking about is about blood and family, I like to start with just the first most common verse of Amazing Grace. But I want us to then sing the second. This is like the 4th or 5th verse that most folks don't get to, just because I think it's really, really appropriate to what we're talking about today. So, 1, 2. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. Let's read the verse on the screen. Yea, when this heart and heart shall fail, and mortal life shall cease, I shall possess within the a lovely verse? People don't really sing it. So, next slide, please. So just to show some pictures. So this is a photograph of my sister Rachel on her wedding day. It's September 1st, 1984. That's me. That was a really emotional day. That was the first time I ever remember crying out of joy. My sister, the woman next to me on my left is my mother, Marina. That's my sister Rachel, always with a big smile. My sister Patricia there, and then my brother Nicholas. My brother Nicholas was actually the one that gave her away. But again, you know, we're at the Knights of Columbus Hall, just like any good white Catholic family would do. Go to the next picture, please. I really like that photograph a lot. And then this is all of us. This is 2006 at my brother Nick's wedding. I mentioned earlier when my Aunt Olivia kind of went out of the blue and just came to say hello to me and tell me how much she loved me. This was later on that day. So here, also, this is the first time, Rachel told me this was the first time since 1978 that all of us had been together in one room. On the far left here is my sister Maria. She was named after my father's mother, Maria Luisa, because Maria Luisa took really good care of my mom. And so when she died, they named my sister after her. During the divorce, she pretty much sided wholesale with my dad. So we don't really communicate very much. There's my brother Nick. That was his wedding day. There's my sister Rachel. You all remember I talked about my Aunt Linda that always had that one expression on her face and the really marvelous eyebrows that she had? Okay, so when Rachel was 13, she plucked her eyebrows super thin and they never grew back. So Rachel was a little frustrated. She's like, I don't have any eyebrows in that picture. So I love my sister Rachel very much. There next is me. Next to that is my brother Richard, who I love dearly. He's single, ladies, if you all are looking for somebody. He just turned, let's see, 16, 61. Just turned 57. And that's my sister Patricia on the far left. So again, you know, by this point, you can pretty much see there's not really a lot just by physical appearances to be able to identify us as Mexican American here. Although Patricia, the one on the far left, this is the one that talked about those illegals coming to the United States and then cooked all this Mexican food the next night. Anyways. So what I want to talk about now, next slide please. Talking about privilege and power, specifically moving between individuality and collectivity. For this the last part of my talk, I have to give a great deal of credit to a woman who has become a mentor and a spiritual director for me by the name of Alexia Salvatierra. She is a Mexican-American Lutheran pastor. She's based in Los Angeles. She is just a force of nature. And she worked with Decolonized Lutheranism, this group that I work with, to have a base community training back in April. And one of the things that she spends a great deal of time talking about is going between this kind of player. Next slide, please. And the one after that. I and me and we. And how so much of these conversations about what it means to be a person that has a fair amount of privilege, of unearned privilege, and what to do with it in such a way that your life becomes a retooling of the privilege that you have, the influence that you have, for the sake of helping the people who don't have it. It was one thing that I really try to stress to a lot of folks. Privilege is not bad. Having privilege is not a bad thing. I have a really good buddy of mine named Ray, born, bred, and raised in Santa Barbara. And some gender issues there as well in their life, and a number of sort of problems with a couple of things. But one of the things that they have been kind of coming to understand is the fact that, and it's been interesting to see, because they come from a family with quite a bit of privilege, but the way that they have been raised is there's a kind of a shame about it, right? Having a family that has some funds, having a family that actually has a fair amount of access to wealth and things like that. And it was crippling for them. But what has been really interesting to see lately is how they understand that because of that privilege that allows them to have a certain kind of an access. It allows them to be able to make a certain kind of an impact. And as I even mentioned with myself earlier, because of my experience in growing up and having the color skin that I do, there is very much not there are some things that I can, gifts and abilities that I have that can help, that I can use to sort of retool to help people that need the kind of access and the skills that I do have. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about. But frequently it comes down to this sort of polarity, going between me and we, or I and we. I, of course, is simply the individualistic, right? And these are good things, right? It's important if we're going to be working to make social change. It's important if we want to try to be able to make some kind of an impact in the world. We need to have a vision. We need to have an understanding of how we can change things. We need to have a true and genuine, not even belief, but even knowing that our one series of efforts and the things that we do can actually make a significant change in the world around us. And these are all very, very healthy things. The difficulty is when that becomes divorced from an understanding of obligation, of community. So the difference between being a person that has access to funds and uses them as a way to make more money from a vulnerable population, as opposed to, say, someone that has a communal understanding, in which case they take more of a prophetic voice. And they use their privilege or their stance to benefit in their community as opposed to take money from it or to take money from a community. And of course, then you have the we axis, right? And that's just simply being part of community. That you have a group of people to whom you are beholden. That there are families, neighborhoods, blocks. That this is part of a matrix of meaning that supports you and that gives you an understanding of where you are and what it is you need to be doing with your life. You find solace and guidance and direction. As Pastor Mike Russell mentioned to me however many years ago, part of what made me so angry was the fact that I didn't have any place that I could lay my head, because it seemed like nobody wanted me to be able to play reindeer games with them. And so having the sense of where you come from, is really quite powerful. And so oftentimes when we start talking about wanting to work in marginalized communities, if we ourselves have privilege, it's really important to understand how those dynamics play out. And this is sort of where Alexia and her insights come in. Next slide. So she talks about when you come from a community of privilege, frequently the movement is from I to we. So let's say you are, you come from a family of privilege, which, you have, you may have family, you may have friends and all of these things, but still the main anchor for how you understand yourself and the way that you relate to the world is based on your individual vision for your own life, what it is you want to do, your personal goals, for the most part, which are largely divorced from the notion of a context or a community. These goals and these ideas benefit you, not necessarily those around you. And so if you come from a privileged community, that is really one of the first steps Alexia says you have to take. You have to shift your notion of who you are to be less about I and more about we. Who or what is the community that you're going to be helping? What are their concerns? What are their needs? What are the ways that you fit in specifically in that context in such a way that you benefit and uplift the folks who are there? Not necessarily yourself, right, but through the power of God. I have to make sure I put that in there, else I'm practicing works righteousness up and down, and Luther wouldn't like that about me. But what are the ways that the power of God work through you within the context of community in order to bring that community into greater unity and peace with God? That is a really, really, really important step, and one that's not necessarily very easy to take. In part because if you come from a community of privilege, going to communities that don't have as much privilege, you're going to have a lot of stuff dumped on you. You're going to have a lot of things, like I mentioned earlier, walking into this room of African Americans and suddenly have everybody tense up because they were expecting my friend Pedro, not someone who looked like me. And so you're going to have to navigate a whole bunch of difficulties, and you're going to have to live under judgment until they get to know you. You're not going to be able to take advantage of the assumptions of your value, of your worth, of your opinions, of your perspectives. You need to live under this scrutiny of a community until it's such time as that community genuinely welcomes you in to be among them. And that can be a very, very hard and long and painful and sometimes a fruitless process. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the community that you want to work with has to reserve the right to say, no, we don't need you, and we don't need your help. That's kind of a hard thing to hear. But it's important. Because if you're going to become part of a community, you need to have the community's blessing. Another person that also has really a big impact on me is Eric Law, and he does a lot of stuff with church inclusion as an Episcopalian. And what he talks about is people that come from privileged communities. They're the resurrected Jesus, right? But the way that they enter these different communities is that they have to come in through the cross. They have to come in through judgment and through death, because that's the only way that they can show if the presence of God is actually going to work through them in the community. Now, doing that is hard, but there's one major thing that comes from that. When you have light-skin privilege, when you have white privilege, there is a kind of a power that you just sort of assume that you're going to have. Well, you have to leave all that behind when you go and work in any kind of marginalized community. But what you have to then do is, when you do that, is you wait for them then to select you, to talk with you and work with you, and then lift you up. So ultimately, it is not your privilege, it is not your goals, it is not your hopes for the community that lift you up and bring you into leadership. It is the community that actually decides themselves to welcome you in. And that is a very, very, very important piece of information to realize. Because if you're going to work with this community, again, they have to be the one to decide. There's actually one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter has a real great thing that he says: get in where you fit in. So, and there's something kind of nice about that, right? Going into a community saying you want to help out, but not necessarily knowing where to go. And they don't necessarily know if they even want to help you. But you just go through the long process of figuring out where you fit in. And as soon as you figure out where you can fit in, you get in. And then you do the work. So that is one of the aspects that is really important for folks that have privilege to work with marginalized communities, is to make this shift from I to we. The next step then is going from, next slide please, we to me. Now, this is more specifically what marginalized communities have to do, is that because of their condition and because of living under the everything from poverty to violence to police brutality, all of these things keep a community pretty demoralized. And so oftentimes, they don't necessarily have the ability to stand up individually to confront and to change situations. But they do have a collective, right? And so this collective becomes really important, not only for maintaining solidarity against difficult situations, but also to help to give a certain kind of identity. But the problem with that, of course, becomes when you are part of a community that lives under oppression, invariably, the oppression can be self-sustaining and perpetuated indefinitely. So on some level, there needs to be an ability to step out from the we to me. And we have seen that time and time again from so many of the great civil rights leaders of the 20th century, whether it's Martin Luther King Jr., whether it is Mahatma Gandhi, whether it is, oh God, I hate it when I can't remember his name. The farm workers, come on, somebody help me out. Cesar Chavez, right? There's an understanding that they come from a collective, that they have a community that is living under really difficult conditions, but that ultimately that they step forward as the person to help, to start, to change how their communities are treated. And this is a really important thing as well that folks in white communities can do as well. Because there very much is a collective that those of us that have light skin privilege or white privilege are raised in, right? But whereas the communities that we come to ultimately want to reaffirm the power that we have, they want to inscribe and make us further buy into this destructive myth of white supremacy and white dominance and white normativity, we have to make a conscious effort to stand out and to say no. I won't do that. So it's not leading by acting as a representative on behalf. It's by being a prophetic voice confronting the collective. So so for me, what has been really kind of interesting is how, and so now I'm going to tell you a little bit how this relates to me. It has been very curious how I do this. Because at the same on one hand, I am very much part of a marginalized community. But I'm from a marginalized community and an individual from a marginalized community that has been broken off from its greater community. And in some respects, I like to say I'm a failed assimilation project. No matter how many times these folks really wanted me to be white and really got mad at me, even when I tried, I still could never, I couldn't. There was something about myself that refused to cave, to bend, to assimilate, to change. And so as a consequence, I know what it's like to experience that kind of pain. But clearly, there are other things that I don't know what it's like to experience. I've been pulled over by cops a fair number of times. I've never once had to worry about being shot. Because of the color of my skin, I think about the one of the neighborhoods where I grew up. When I was about 11 years old, my mom basically moved into a tenement apartment, but in a very, very nice neighborhood in Kansas City. And one of the things that was really helpful for me was that that's when I started my entrepreneurial sense. I would shovel driveways, rake leaves, do yard work as a kid. But it was a heck of a lot easier for me to do in this middle class, upper middle class neighborhood, because it wasn't like, who was it? That was my buddy Michael, African American. Because I told him, like, hey, why don't you do this? I've been knocking on door to doors. I'll leave them a little card. And he told me he went to the same neighborhoods, but they didn't treat him very well. People wouldn't answer the door. I don't remember him saying anybody called the police on him, but I remember that was one of those moments where I suddenly realized, oh my God, it's only because he's black. And so there are things, even though I'm Mexican American, even though I'm a Latino, clearly I was able to make extra money so my mom wouldn't have to take care of me because we were quite poor. I was able to do things in that neighborhood because of the color of my skin that my friend couldn't because he was black. So living with all those experiences too, on the other hand, I also have to figure out what is the way that I also, as somebody with privilege, moves from I to we. So how I do that, like I said, I don't necessarily know how this will work out for everybody. But the way that I ended up, could you go to the previous slide? So the way that I moved from I to we was by essentially going back to my roots. This is one of the things that is very, very different because most white folks, when they go to work with Latinos, they're going to learn about a different culture, they're going to immerse themselves and actually change how they view things. For me, it was very different. It was returning to the Latino community kind of, and we even joke about that. I would tell folks, soy un Latino exilado. I'm an exiled Latino, right? Because that's literally what happened to me. I couldn't be part of the Mexican-American community growing up as a child because it was literally a risk to my life. And my mother made efforts to make sure that I had all the best education possible, which invariably took me into all-white spaces as a child and through much of my adolescence and my youth. So I had a lot of learning that I had to do, which I had kind of in fits and starts in different places, either through friends or through my travels or meeting other Latinos and, kind of picking things up here and there. But I had to make a conscious effort to immerse myself within the needs of the Latino community. There was so much reading that I did. There were so many protests that I went to. It included everything from really beefing up on my Spanish. As I mentioned earlier, my time at the Hispanic Summer Program was really quite formative. And then essentially being and accumulating all of this wisdom and understanding that I wasn't capable of having because of my the way that my life had worked out. But at the same token, though, as someone coming from this, that was raised to be white, as I mentioned earlier, I did have some skills that were really quite helpful. And so what ended up happening is that when I would work with these Latino communities, invariably, I ended up working either as a fundraiser or as an event coordinator. And that worked perfectly fine for me because, one, these were things that I was quite good at and I rather enjoyed doing. And they certainly liked having somebody that could literally bring 6, 7, 8 times more money in than they could because of my association with white churches, because of the connections that I had with, I knew how to reach out to law firms and things like that. And I clearly know how to talk the way they talk. I know how to speak fundraising language. All of these things came in handy for me because I had a kind of a privilege because of where I came from that they didn't. And so I retooled it for the sake of helping them. So that's kind of where my journey from I to we worked out. Go to the other slide, please, Brian. But there was also a movement from we to me. And this is where it gets kind of weird, and I kind of gave it away earlier. So the we that I grew up with, the community that I grew up with, although it wasn't really community, was one that was grounded in white supremacy. And being aware of that and understanding that, though very much aware too of how it was as a Latino, how I was treated, how I was marginalized, how I was taught through slow doses over many decades that everything about me was wrong. And that's true, right? I still experience racism. But at the same token, I was still raised in the culture. So what I was able to do was that my me was not from the perspective of, well, I'm going to help my community, because they were never my community. But I knew enough about them that I could turn back and look at white folks. And not necessarily, at times I was just flat out judgmental. It was part of my healing process, making this active purgation of whiteness from my mind and my life. There's a really hilarious story. A buddy of mine, Faenya. Did you guys ever know Faenya? Faenya Burford Berry? She's a newly minted pastor. There was one day I was looking at this flyer for some Lutheran worship thing. It was all these white folks, and I was joking about how one of them looked. And then she picked up that flyer and she looked at it and she goes, "What are you talking about? You look just like him." Slapped the flyer down. And I kind of perked up. She goes, "Francisco, stop hating on white people so much. It's not going to help you." Right? So on some level, yeah, there was that confrontational aspect, right? This is how your community treated me. You told me that you would do these things for me. You made these promises to me, but all you were trying to do was kill me this entire time. I literally went back over the entirety of my life and I realized how much I'd been lied to. Clearly that makes you kind of angry. But now what I'm really trying to move towards is a little bit different of a sense. It's like, I'll come and I'll talk with audiences like this or audiences that have a bit harder of a time with understanding white supremacy and how it benefits their lives. And I'll let them know, like, yo, it's actually not that bad. It's good to talk about these things. It's good to talk about the ways that your skin color directly impacts literally everybody around you that doesn't share your skin color, whether you're aware of it or not. It is good to learn about these things because, yeah, I'm Mexican American, yeah, my name is Francisco Herrera, yo puedo hablar en español con todo el mundo aquí, mi familia viene de Zacatecas, I can do all that, I have all of that. But in order for me to claim my Latinidad, my Latinness, I had to first understand that the way that my whiteness infected it. But in order to do that, I had to understand my whiteness. And so what I try to do then is to work with other white church folks or administrators or leaders to basically let them know, yo, it's not the end of the world. I'm not even white, but I did it. And you know what? It just made my life better. I'm less likely to cause problems in relationships. I'm much less likely to, again, less likely doesn't mean I won't do it. I'm just less likely to cause problems in projects or in collaborative situations where I'm working on. I'm much less likely to trigger people, depending on the situation. But the best part is that I'm much more likely to make very good friends. And I'm much more likely to benefit from an enormous amount of the insight and the theological perspectives, the families, the food. So many communities of color just have much better food. I thought that joke would get a bigger laugh. Thank you. There we go. These were all things that I've been able to do since really seriously processing my white privilege, but only because I spent so much time understanding how I benefit from these things. Because in the end of the day, it was much more important that I have serious and substantive relationships with the people that I work with than just to simply sit back and stay in my privilege. Next two slides later, please. So, so we're Lutherans, right? So there are a couple of really great lines of Luther that I think really directly impact us here. So Christ frees us so that we may serve our neighbor. This is something that he wrote in a wonderful treatise that I just wrote an essay about for Augsburg Fortress called The Temporal Authority, the Extent to Which It Should Be Obeyed. Because for Luther, being saved by grace didn't mean that you didn't have to do anything. It literally meant that because you have been freed by the grace of God, it frees you of the worry for the state of your soul so you can focus on taking care of your neighbor. Or, another thing that Luther said, this comes from a much more obscure treatise, and it doesn't exactly say it like this, but God doesn't need your good works, but your neighbor does. Because for me, this whole process fundamentally means I am learning how to be a better neighbor. I also really like, I really like using the word neighbor, because the word that in German that Luther uses for neighbor is Nächsten. Now there is another word that you can use for neighbor, it's kind of more like the modern word for neighbor, Nachbar. But Nächsten, Nachbar means, the idea is like it's something that dwells or that lives next to you, so there's a notion of permanence. However, the word that Luther uses in his German original is Nächsten, which literally means people that are next to you. So your neighbor is not necessarily the person that lives next to you in your house. The neighbor is who you're next to in the pew, or when you're on a bus, or when you're standing in line getting coffee. Anybody who is in close proximity to you. So he has a very, very wide understanding of what it means to be a neighbor. And so based on the conversation that I have today, there are a couple of questions that I want to leave everybody with that are sort of tied to my presentation, and that I hope that you can ponder over the course of the next few years or months or whatever. The first one is, what are the things in your past that can connect you to the suffering of others? What are the things in your past that can connect you, in your family's past, that can connect you to the suffering of others? When I talk with Lutherans specifically about Latino ministry, one of the things that I try to break down is the notion that, that these immigrants from Mexico or El Salvador are so different from them. They're not. I have, my home congregation has a great large number of Swedes. Well, every single one of them had grandparents that came here as a consequence of famine, or parents that came here as a consequence of war. So, and I think like after World War II, 40% of the world's Lutherans were war refugees. So there is a history there within their family tied to the faith and the ethnic origins of the people that can be a really wonderful basis for resistance and for understanding the plight of immigrants as well as people of color or marginalized communities. Because of this rooting in violence and war and running and pain. Texas has a lot of German Lutherans. And Texas is not necessarily known for being a particularly nice place for marginalized communities. But the German Lutherans themselves actually have a curious history. Many of them came to Germany and came from Germany and moved to Texas as a consequence of the Mexican-American War. Horrible, horrible, horrible. Long story. The Alamo is that should be like a war crimes trial site. It's just, I never feel good going there. But what happened is that the Germans that actually came in were themselves escaping religious and actually political persecution because of a lot of the essentially pro-democracy movements that were going on in Germany in the 1840s. What's more is that what was one nice thing about all these German Lutherans going to Texas is they were fierce abolitionists. They believed that slavery was just one of the worst things ever, and they actively collaborated with abolitionists all throughout the United States to work to abolish slavery. Did any of you see the movie Django Unchained? My brother over here, right? So the hunter guy, right? The German. There you go. That's where Tarantino got the archetype for that character. I can never remember his name. Because he was militant about, he just thought that slavery was wrong and that it needed to be abolished from the country. And so as a consequence, these Germans took these very, very powerful abolitionist views with them into Texas. And as a consequence, between the fact that they were German, didn't speak the language, between the fact that they tended to actually align pretty well with the Mexicans who lived in the region, as well as the natives, they were much more conciliatory because they understood political persecution, and the fact that they were actually against slavery passionately, the Lutherans in Texas were treated actually really pretty horribly for a long time. Then, of course, having 2 world wars with the Germans, that tended to turn them inward. And so, yeah, it's interesting for me when I talk with Texas Lutherans that are German descent, the fact that they never talk about that history. That a Lutheran community that has quite a bit of serious, radical, unpleasant conservatism in it actually has roots in political persecution in Germany and abolitionism. Those are all things that can be very, very beneficial when you're trying to figure out how to ground yourself in your work for liberation. And the next question, and this is also important to ask, what are aspects of your family history and story that create suffering for others? What are aspects of your family history and story that create suffering for others? Because invariably, if you're a person of privilege, aspects of your story will create suffering for other people. Invariably. And this happens on all levels. Lately, someone with whom I've had this exact same conversation with, a marvelous activist, she's a Muslim, her name's Hind Meki, she's Sudanese-American, has the sharpest wit of anybody I've ever met in my life. But one of the things about her, especially because she wears the hijab, and because she comes from East Africa, so the facial features are a little different, is that frequently Muslims don't realize that she's African descent. And so she'll be hanging out with Muslims from India or from the Middle East, and all of a sudden they'll start saying really bad things about black people. Now, she's so funny. She has a hashtag for that. She calls that incognito. She's so funny. Like, right, she has this new thing, this new hashtag she came up with a couple of months ago, where very, very devout, very intelligent Muslim women go to these conferences and have these other Muslim men, sometimes clerics, explain things to them that they already know. She calls that iman-splaining. I mean, like, where do you get this? So, but one of the things that she talks about a great deal, especially for her with intersectionality, is the fact that as a black woman that can pass for Indian or as Arabic, she has access to spaces that others don't. And her name is Hind Meki, nice Arabic name. So people can't necessarily tell that her family is from the Sudan. And so there are things that she does to kind of struggle with that as well. So even though she is a black woman from a refugee family that lives in the United States, and she's a Muslim, there are still ways that she has privilege and power over other people in the Islamic community. I mean, it's mind-blowing. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. Because once you start asking those two questions, what are the things in your personal history, with your family's history, that can connect you with histories of people who are who have undergone oppression, as well as what are the same aspects of that same history that could potentially cause problems for others? You give essentially a really nice cruciform, right? So you make a cross. And it gives you a way to kind of anchor yourself, to make sure that you keep your priorities focused as someone who understands the history of oppression in your own family. But at the same token, you also make sure that you don't keep them so focused that you don't pay attention to the pain you might cause, or to the discomfort that you're creating based on what you're talking about, how you raise certain arguments. And it's a really simple and effective way, I think, that folks that are raised with a certain kind of privilege can at least make sure that they genuinely do more harm than good. And it's a practice that I do pretty regularly for the work that I do, and so as a consequence, I strongly recommend it for everybody. So, go ahead, 2 slides, please. So that's my total plug. That's all my stuff. If you want to find me on Facebook, my Facebook profile is facebook.com/decolonize.evangelist. My Twitter handle is polyglot-evangel. And if you want to see a really good chance of a lot of the things that I've written with this group, Decolonize Lutheranism, just put in hashtag Decolonize Lutheranism. Of course, we have the Decolonize Lutheranism website, decolonizelutheranism.org, and then my personal blog, Love is Revolution, at blogspot.com. Feel free to look me up if you have questions. Kind of running out of time, and I certainly rambled a lot more than I intended. Big surprise. But I do want to, can we at least take maybe 2 questions before we close shop? Is that okay? We'll go over time just a little bit, promise. So let's go to the questions then. I'm actually curious. So who here can tell me right now what your family history is that connects you to people who've gone through suffering and oppression? Sir, there's a microphone.
My family history was Danish, and that most of my family was part of the underground during World War II.
Okay. Yeah.
And my family was part of the flotilla that moved the Jewish people from Denmark to Sweden in the Great Evening. So, I mean, that's part of the big part of my family.
Mm-hmm. And do you talk about that?
Yeah, we do.
Because that's huge.
Well, and I mean, it was a huge part for me because when I was in elementary school, that I happened to have 2 friends. They were Cole and Zarko, and that they were about the only 2 black kids in my school, but that they played the games that I like to play, and I was taken into the principal's office because I was antisocial, and that I wasn't playing with white kids. I was only playing with Cole and Zarko, and so that they thought that was something that needed to be taken care of, and so they took me to the principal's office and called my home, and that my mom wasn't home that day, so they called my grandparents. And my grandmother came in, and she wanted to know what the problem was, what I'd done wrong. And when the principal explained that I was being antisocial, I was only playing with black children, that she was completely incensed because, and she told him, I was sitting there, and it was the first time I'd heard. King Christian came out the day after the Nazis told the Danes that they had to have the yellow star on their jackets. He said, "There are no Jews in Denmark, only Danes." And she said, and Denmark goes down into the Virgin Islands, and all of those people are black, and they speak Danish. So they are Danes too. She said, so what's he doing wrong? So yeah, we talked about it.
So then the follow-up question then is that what about your family history, however, is a source of pain and suffering for people? Because the Danish also have a very, very, very dark colonial history as well.
I'm very well aware of that too.
Tell us.
Oh.
I mean, I know.
Get my microphone back?
Yeah, you do. Two-part question.
I mean, I'm very aware of in South Africa that the Danish holdings in South Africa were very oppressive to the people, and that of South Africa, and they were part of the diamond mines, and that at least all of that. And I'm also very aware of in the 70s when the Middle Eastern people were coming into Denmark, that they were treated like second-class citizens. We happened to be visiting in 1971, and that the great disgust of the people in Denmark, of the Middle Eastern people as they came, and my one cousin saying, "Now I understand what the problem with slavery was in the United States." And I was like, you haven't got a clue. So yeah, I know that there's that Danes cause a lot of pain besides.
Right. So we have those traditions in us. So figuring out a way, now that you're aware of that story, what are the ways that you can use, this is a rhetorical question right now, what are the ways that you can use that to prepare yourself to work with marginalized communities? One more person answer those two questions. Somebody? Otherwise, I'm going to call on Katya, because I know she does. This is a really interesting story.
Well, I could tell a couple different interesting stories, but for example, my grandfather lived in occupied France during World War II. He was forced to work for the Nazis. He worked for a company that made airplanes. Somehow, nobody at that company was good enough to make a functional airplane, apparently, during the entirety of the...
They're French. Sorry. I can't stand them. I lived among them for
so
years.
that was their little bit of rebellion, but he broke curfew to work at a bakery so that he could get enough money to have bread, or so that he could take home the extra bread from the bakery. And so he was really living on the edge there. His family at that point were refugees. They had a passport. My grandpa had a passport, which I don't know where it is now, but I've seen it, that said that he was a citizen of nowhere, because his previous country no longer existed, and the countries where his family had fled to didn't want him. So that's one example. Another example is, fast forward a few years later, and my grandpa's married to my Puerto Rican grandmother. And have you guys seen the show West Side Story?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my grandma's family. They weren't quite as much into the gangs, but they were part of the Puerto Rican community that was living in the Bronx. I mean, at that time in history. So it's actually really painful for me. The last time I saw that show, I left the theater shaking and realized I couldn't see it again because it was hit too close to home. But then on the other side, my grandfather, who was a refugee during World War II and a citizen of nowhere. Well, the reason that he was a refugee was because the aristocrats had been kicked out of Russia because they were in charge of all the serfs, which was just kind of a nicer word for slaves. The aristocracy held so much of the land, and they were very oppressive to the people that worked the land, and the people who worked the land were never able to own land themselves, and that's why the Russian Revolution happened. And it was because the Russian Revolution happened that my grandfather's parents, who were aristocrats, were kicked out of the country. They literally had to flee for their lives, but it was because they had been oppressing people, and their family system had been oppressing people for hundreds and hundreds of years before that. So it's all kind of wrapped up into one family story, and I know that if we do enough digging, all of us can find things like that in our family histories.
And the most important thing is, for me, it just ties something to your blood. There's one thing that whiteness does a really, really good thing, is it tries to make everybody think that their bodies aren't important, unless they're tools to be abused or used for, economic gain. So going back and finding these stories and finding your connections to these personal histories, I often find just very salutary as a oh yeah, sorry. And I in general find the seeking of these stories also just really salutary. I mean, they're just good for your health, to know something about where you come from, and to get an idea for even maybe like a little bit where you find your personality. But these are really, really good things to know. And these kind of stories actually can come in handy too when you're talking with folks, like talking with your Puerto Rican relatives about what happened with your Russian family and all of those things. I think about how many friends that I have that are Mexican that have Russian names, because so many Russians went there, not so much after the Russian Revolution, but as a consequence of Stalin and what he was doing. So many Russians fled to Mexico because it was one of the few places that would give them the visas. So yeah, so I know this guy named Vladimir Lopez. Yeah, immigration. Well, listen, thank you all very, very much. Like I said, all of my information is up there. Feel free to contact me, find me on Facebook. Everybody finds me on Facebook. And thank you so much for welcoming me out here today. And thank you also to Bishop Vivian for the invitation. And yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Francisco. And I think we all have been fed. And as I said at the beginning, the next, you have the information, you'll all be receiving the information and what matters for the things that are coming up. And once again, just really appreciate what we got today. So, thanks.